First off, I've got to say that all the drivers this weekend, they're winners in my book. They are absolute troopers for sticking it out there despite the harsh conditions, the dehydration, the fatigue they must have been dealing with, as well as the nausea. Thank you for providing us an entertaining weekend. And Logan, fair play. I appreciate the fact that you admitted that you had reached your limits and decided to call it early instead of risking your own safety, just providing entertainment and thinking that you had to be brave and tough. So drivers, crew, everyone who was working this weekend, thank you. But when it comes to the graphics themselves that we barely saw throughout the entire weekend, the tyre age graph, seriously, what would it have taken to actually provide us a just quick little addition to the driver ladder chart saying that, oh, so-and-so on these tyres have only 10 laps to go or something like that, and not have to go back to the chart that Pirelli actually gave us before the race and then thinking, okay, so they started on that tyre and then we have to maybe think of the fact they used these tyres in a previous session, and you don't want to be doing that mental arithmetic while you're actually watching a race. You just want to know, how many laps? Oh, 8. Gotcha. They did provide some graphics sometimes saying so-and-so has to stop before this particular lap. That was something, but I felt like it could have been better implemented. But when it comes to the actual winners proper, Verstappen, 3 world titles this weekend. He did it in style during the sprint race. This is something to commend Max for achieving. If you're not a fan of his, you can at least respect the fact that the car and driver combination here is simply breathtaking and breaking all sorts of records with seemingly minimal exertion. So, well done, Max. And I hope you have a more compelling challenge next year to keep your spirits up and make it more exciting for you. But I think you all saw this coming. I've got to talk about Oscar Piastri. Even though some of his comments throughout the entire weekend aren't exactly PR friendly or they're orthodox, they were utterly hilarious. I think this weekend has been doing wonders for his social media presence and reputation and charming people into thinking that, hey, he's not a robot. He's not boring. He's actually got some really good quips. And even though he's a rookie, he won the sprint race. He got second at the Spa sprint race. We're starting to see that Oscar Piastri is really good when it comes to sprint races. Maybe also it actually negates the whole issues with tyre deg and race pace over long distances. But either way, he gets good results in those, and this is the first win of any kind that McLaren have had since Daniel Ricciardo got his in 2021. So maybe that's just a nice little thing to have. I'm so proud of the chap and how settled he looks so early on. And I've always valued him, even back in 2020 when I saw him in F3. He just seems really cool and collected. And the way that he's handling himself against the pressure of Lando Norris shows that McLaren really backed the right horse here. And even though people at the beginning of the year were really speculative about all of this, McLaren have now secured themselves a brilliant driver lineup for the next 2 seasons in terms of their skill. But whether or not this might lead to confrontation or not remains to be seen. But I think that McLaren are going to be the more experienced team in how to handle intra-team rivalries. I think they'll be able to keep a lid on this. I think. We need to see 2024 first, but 2025 Oscar Piastri, that's gonna be spicy. And speaking of the team itself, brilliant. This is showing that the pace that they've actually acquired since Austria is real. This isn't some kind of fluke. They now have a car that is relatively complete. And sure, we didn't have many low speed corners. In fact, we only had one that was around about still 60 miles an hour. You still got to see McLaren overcoming their flaws that they saw at the beginning of the season. This is giving something that Lando Norris has been craving, a car that can win. Oscar and Lando were not falling back that much, and the gap between them and Leclerc was over half a minute. And even Leclerc was on the radio going, oh my God, okay. They don't have an answer to it at the moment at Qatar. And Austin, this is going to have quite a few high-speed corners too, but more low-speed. So it may not be as dominant next time out, but here, this was excellent. Loads and loads and loads of points. I will include Norris in here as well, since he did recover from his quali and sprint gas to get P3 in both races, which is a good display of his skill. But it does make you wonder what he could do if he didn't have those mistakes from the start. He might have been P2 in both sessions and probably outclassing Oscar without having those mistakes in the back of his mind. But you feel like if Lando can just reset into next year and realize that he's going to have a tougher challenge on his hands with Oscar, you might actually see an even better Lando, more complete, more adjusted, more acclimatized to the idea of the fact that my teammate is really, really good, and I've got to bring it. I'm going to stick Alex Albon in the winners, but only just for the fact that Williams were not really expecting anything this weekend. This is the kind of track that they dread. But even then, they still got 2 points out of it. Amidst the Alfa Romeo stroke of good fortune and Haas's upgrade next time out, these are all the points they desperately need and could be critical come the end of the season. But speaking of luck, Alfa Romeo, a double points finish. Wow! No longer staring last place in the face, and have actually overtaken Haas, and are only 7 points behind Williams, so maybe P7 doesn't look so impossible after all. But then again, you don't really feel like Alfa Romeo are putting in that many upgrades at the moment, so maybe this momentum might be a false dawn. But quite frankly, Bottas and Zhou scoring points, that is very necessary for their morale, showing that their car can do something, it can be good. And Bottas, he was actually solid the entire weekend, getting into Q3 and staying in the top 10 ultimately. That is something to be commended. Definitely a winner here, considering the anonymous season they've had. Now we're talking about the drivers who are a little bit, in my opinion, neither good or neither bad, and Alpine are the first ones. Having been simulated and predicted to be the slowest team, getting into Q3 was a really solid achievement, as well as Gasly nearly getting a point in the Manic Sprint. Getting points? It's something. It's something to cheer about because they are in no man's land in P6. They could have had a double points finish had Gasly not got those track limit penalties, because we did see that driver dance and Gasly was on course for P9 until he wasn't and he got 12th. For Alonso, this was a bit of a mixed bag. He made some really weird mistakes and yet he managed to pull that car into some decent points. A P6 amidst a track that they weren't expected to do well at? That wasn't bad at all, and considering all of the stuff that was happening with Stroll, Alonso just quietly got on with it, qualified P4, managed to get some points, 9 points for the team, which is better than nothing, and he showed what he can actually do in an underpowered and underdeveloped car in comparison to the rest of the grid. And also, he was dealing with the fact that his car was burning, his seat was almost on fire, and he was still able to keep it in the points and get a P6. That shows the mettle of that driver and why Aston Martin have really got themselves a good investment and someone to really build a team around. That was really, really good. But again, when he made that really weird mistake in turn 2, the same place where Lawson span off, and then joined the track in a really, really dangerous manner in front of Leclerc, that was uncharacteristically odd, but maybe he was in a hurry, but don't endanger other drivers, please. Mercedes. I bet you're all wondering what I think about this. Well, ultimately, they came out of this weekend with more points than Ferrari, despite all of the chicanery in the race. And they actually had a pretty decent sprint race with both cars scoring points, and Ferrari not scoring that many points. With Leclerc, he had that 5-second penalty. That was a really good start. And then their start led to complications between George and Lewis. And you might have seen my reaction on the Last Lap podcast, which I was graciously invited to by Tomo. And we were all absolutely shocked, trying to figure out what had happened. We were spending the next 5 minutes trying to figure out who actually was at fault. But when you actually started to see the replays, when they eventually came in, it was clear that George had really nowhere to go without compromising his position with Max, and then Lewis was going around the outside trying to be Dan Dare and trying to get P1 surprisingly and then do hammer time for the next few laps, and it just didn't work out. Lewis immediately went out and said, look, that was my fault. I tried something, it didn't work, so don't blame George. So this time George really had done nothing wrong. But then at the same time, you find out from George that there was a discussion about this, them being on different tyres, and what the plan was for Lewis to actually get past and then just get as far as you can in front of Max, but it still happened. But I really don't think this is a flashpoint, because they both held their hands up and said, look, we don't blame one another. This was just another bad accident. Kind of like what we saw in Spain when their front wings touched and we got that little bit of a mess. This is a little bit of something out of nothing, but at least Lewis took the blame this time. This is definitely not a Hamilton-Rosberg incident in 2016. They weren't taking each other out in the fit of pique. This was just bad luck. And also, what was George going to do? George would have had to back off suddenly, and he may have gone into the front of another driver behind, maybe one of the McLaren drivers, and may have taken them out too, and it would have just looked even worse. So realistically, George was stuck, and Lewis turned in a little bit too soon, and also got a taste of his own medicine with the incidents regarding Albon. It was almost a carbon copy. Like I said, they still came away with more points than Ferrari, so the battle for P2, they got themselves some breathing space again, so this was absolutely vital. They messed things up and still turned out a better job than Ferrari. And speaking of Ferrari, for the sprint, going on the softs, bad call. I think that if they'd gone on the mediums, they would have actually fared pretty decently and probably taken 4th and 5th from the likes of the Mercedes teams. And the drop-off in the softs was just astoundingly drastic. I've never seen something like that in years. And then Leclerc gets his penalty, and then Carlos has that fuel leak and they can't fix it, so you're one driver down, and Leclerc then goes on to have a okay race. He gets P5 without any trouble, but he's half a minute behind the McLarens, so this is something a little bit concerning. And what's also more concerning with the McLarens is that they thought that P3 was safe, that McLaren wouldn't catch up. Well, McLaren scored 34 points more than them in one weekend, and now they're under 80 points behind the Scuderia. And of course, I think Ferrari do have enough resources and talent to be able to keep McLaren away from overtaking them, but McLaren will get closer, and it's up to them to try and limit how close McLaren get. So that's something to consider as well. They're trying to fight for P2 with Mercedes, but they now got to look behind their shoulder and go like, oh god, or oh mamma mia, McLaren are right behind, oh dear. It's like 2021 all over again. McLaren catching them up is now improbable rather than impossible. Now we're going to get to the losers. And I bet you're wondering whether I'm going to include a certain person or not. Well, no. Lance Stroll's already had enough troubles this weekend. I talked about it in this video right here, so I really don't need to go into further detail. I've already said what I said, but Lance Stroll has actually said something about it, saying that he and his personal trainer are good now, that he's a bro. We didn't really get an apology, but I think that's the best we're going to get, quite frankly, so okay. But then we need to talk about Pirelli. Their tyres were found out to be not sufficient for the pyramid curbs and dips of the wide curbs added by the Qatar organisers that the drivers were busy having fun with. In Pirelli's defence, they didn't provide unsafe tyres. They didn't do that. It was just something that they hadn't expected. The Qatar Grand Prix organisers had implemented these curbs that Pirelli weren't consulted with before the event, so they had to think on the fly, see the evidence from practice and go like, uh-oh, we didn't anticipate this. We've not really seen these types of curbs before. Maybe we might need to limit how long the tyres can go because we really don't have the data. I think it's best to be safe than sorry, considering that all of the other drivers are having to deal with the heat, exhaustion, dehydration. They don't need the worry of a puncture on their mind. So actually, Pirelli did the drivers a service. So I actually don't mind them doing this pit stop thing. It actually threw in some jeopardy. So, I mean, this was just a lose in the fact that, you know, they kind of got caught with their pants down. But to be fair, they did provide some sort of counter, which actually led to safety, so okay. Carlos Sainz, I mean, it's simple, really. He never really got going this entire weekend. Yeah, of course, he had a decent sprint weekend, and then he had the fuel leak, so he couldn't even start the race. So I would say, if you got a did not start and it wasn't your fault, that's just loser territory already. And it's really a shame too, because last few races he's had some really good form, and this is this thing that's just broken the trend, but maybe he'll come back fighting for Austin. It's just unfortunate, really. Went out in Q2 on the Friday, and yeah, it was just a messy weekend, and he really didn't have a chance to try and make up for it. Maybe he might have scored some points, but we'll never know. Hulkenberg, I mean, oh my goodness. I mean, this was just bad luck for him. Sure enough, they were practically near the bottom, so that's to be expected. But in the sprint, he was looking close to getting a point, so this was something that Haas desperately need, especially since Alfa Romeo jumped past them. But then he got caught in the Ocon Perez thing. He was just going to be in a sandwich, which is a trend from this weekend, and he pulled back and the damage was done. So here's hoping that K-Mag and Hulk can bounce back from this with this Austin upgrade, that it can provide something for them, some more points. Lawson, a less than ideal final weekend for now, but at least he was open to admit his mistakes, which were very strange. Going into turn 2, then having just a sudden snap of his wheel and no one actually colliding with him, he just did it to himself. That was really bizarre and uncharacteristic from what we've seen in the last 3 races, but we've got to remember here, he is a rookie, and this AlphaTauri car was not predicted to do well. Tsunoda was only a couple of places higher, so we weren't really going to be expecting fireworks or points from Lawson this weekend, but we weren't really expecting a messy sprint. But he at least managed to bring it home in the race, albeit at the back, but at least he finished. Despite all of these absolutely atrocious conditions, Lawson managed to stick it out, and he's okay. He's fine. So this is an absolute test of endurance, and Lawson passed the test. And Logan passed the test too, for being able to even drive a car. So that's something in and of itself, and Logan was admitting that he couldn't go any further, and that was brave of him to do so. And Lawson, all the drivers, brave of them to even stick out or even try. So props to them. Okay, we've got to talk about Checo. And I promise not to be harsh on the guy, but he's really not doing himself any favors, is he? Qualifying? That wasn't good. And I know track limits were a problem for many drivers, including the McLaren drivers, but, you know, it still happened to Checo and it didn't happen to Max. And I know you're going to be saying that, oh, the accident was his fault. No, it wasn't his fault. It was a racing incident. No one driver was more to blame than the other drivers. It just happened. It's just sad that it happened to him, that he couldn't have a chance to score some decent points, and it's just another blot on his book. And it's something that Christian Horner's looking at and not liking. But then we got to the race and he had track limit violations. He had that 10-second penalty for the third chassis thing, but that wasn't his fault. He took a new power unit hoping to make some gains, but that didn't work out too well for him. He managed to at least score a point, but then he probably scored many negative points with Christian Horner, because we're now starting to see the evolution of the driver dismissal at Red Bull coming into play, with Christian Horner looking very serious and going, this is not ideal. We need to take a look at the situation with Checo and figure out a solution. It wasn't as sympathetic as we've seen before. It looked very stern. And then on the radio saying, these 5-second penalties are hurting our race. So he's getting the G up from his race engineer saying, this is not looking good. This is going to harm our strategy. These are things you do not want to hear. I don't want to bag on Checo, but these things just keep happening. He needs to sort this out. He needs a complete reset into 2024. I'm really feeling sorry for the guy, and I want to be fair, but there really isn't anything to actually say that he did well at, except for the fact that he managed to make it to the end of the race and, you know, not collapse. That's something. Anything that could happen to that car happened. I would actually say that Alfa Romeo were one of the biggest surprises this weekend, despite the whole McLaren and Mercedes things. And if you want to know why I think it's such a big deal, you might want to watch this video next as to why Alfa Romeo have just been a little bit sleepy. The sleeping giant might awake soon.